Eaten Alive does not get much credit as the major Hooper masterpiece which it is, and it is understandable why. VHS and DVD resolutions did this film zero justice, although in HD we come to realise that Eaten Alive is a highly stirring and rapturing undertaking within horror genre cinema. What does Eaten Alive do wrong? If Eaten Alive were considered one of the classics, no one would question it. Some would, but really not very many. When it isn't considered a classic, people choose to not find much of value in it. A film's qualities become a lot more impressive when people have already been told to relegate its attributes as an indicator of authorial genius. This isn't me saying that more films are highly rated or acclaimed than deserve it, but more that certain films also are deserving of celebration or acclaim like those other summer films, and we ought not to dismiss them for generally superficial reasons, forced out of not being psychologically permitted to, consider the film as approaching significant classic status. Some of you are probably thinking, I don't care much for this film, and I wouldn't even if it were considered a one. That's fine, as in a classic, not a film, obviously it's a feature film. That's fine, I'm willing to assume you question the quality of a number of acclaimed classics too. That is totally valid. Some fairly articulate commenters have presented what I thought were usually understandable reasons for not caring much for certain designated classic films. My problem is if the people who just like the canonized classics and everything else is just not up to scratch for some odd coincidental reason. I do like most of the classics, this is true, though some I don't love nearly as much as some others do, I have noticed, especially looking at what ranks near the top of the recent TSPDT list. Some of those films I love or very much admire, but I would never think of placing it in the top 50 compared with, say, for example, the other 25 odd in that top 50, But in liking most of the designated classics, I'm also able to look at certain films outside of that and ask, but why not this one too? So Tobe Hooper, some people consider him just a one classic wonder with 74's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then he just went and directed a bunch of crap after that. It would be like how people ought to sooner address Wes Craven, except Wes Craven never directed any good films. Okay, Hills Have Eyes, which never would have existed without Texas Chainsaw anyway, it is pretty obvious. However, I do quite admire the wider filmography of Mr. Hooper, even if I grant that none of it can truly match Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Some of his earlier films were totally excellent works of the genre continuum. Really, few films match Texas Chainsaw Massacre for me in general, so Tobe Hooper, or otherwise, that is not something I anticipate many other films might do. But you look at Eggshells, this title, Eaten Alive, aspects of a film he has a co-director credit on, titled The Dark, released in 1979, the Salem's Lot miniseries, which is near the top of King film adaptations, and that is definitely saying something, 85's Life Force, the wonderfully classic sequel, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, and of course Spontaneous Combustion, which was actually discussed on this program years ago now. Now, was everything after that garbage? Yes, there's no question, unfortunately, but for a 20-odd year period, he was a really extraordinary horror helmsman. Oh, I do not care much for the Funhouse, proof that the slasher genre had no merits, or very little to notice, despite the pre-existence of Giallo, and the influential slashers, including major titles such as Carpenter's Halloween, and that not even Hooper with a budget could save it from that aggressively cynical, predictable, unriveting formula. And many claim that Poltergeist is really a Spielberg film. Fine, it probably is that. I don't care for it no matter who directed it, and I never have. Don't think that I ever will. If it weren't for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, yeah, I think there would be a case to be made that Eaten Alive is the best film directed by Tobe Hooper. From a horror fan's perspective, it is hard to see where Eaten Alive really does very much particularly wrong. But Mr. Bruckner, you are asking, is Eaten Alive the best croc-related horror film of all time? Whilst I have no intention of putting down The Great Alligator, directed by Sergio Martino, Crocodile by Sompote Sands, both released in 1979, and certainly not Australia's 1987 complete masterpiece Dark Age, the most significant competitor to Eaten Alive in my own view, or the 1989 creature feature Kill the Crocodile, discussed years ago on this channel, directed by Fabrizio De Angelis. Never saw but would eventually like to the sequel, Kill the Crocodile 2, from 1991. And 1980's Alligator is really not so bad either. Maybe I ought to check out Alligator 2 The Mutation, released later in 1991. Another Australian film, Rogue, from 2007, is not bad for what it is, emphasis being on for what it is, and I still would like to one day see that 2019 flick, Crawl, which is directed by Alexandre Aja, who had directed a relatively good horror film called High Tension from 2003, which some of you may have seen or be aware of. So, other than Dark Age, yes, it is eaten alive, for sure, without any approaching doubt.